Hello, welcome to Towton Moor in North Yorkshire. It's here on the 29th of March 1461 that the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil took place as part of the Wars of the Roses, fought between combatants from the House of York on one side and the House of Lancaster on the other. We're going to be taking a look at some of the monuments and memorials to the war dead around the battlefield here. We're going to have a look at the battlefield itself behind me and ahead of me here. And we're also going to take a look at some of the churches and chapels associated with the battle, in particular Saxton Church and the chapel at Lead. My name is Chris, this is Church Searcher, and I'll see you after the map. So Towton Moor is a plateau quite high up and exposed. You can see for miles all around here. Sunny day today, but in 1461 the battle on the 29th of March took place on Palm Sunday in a snowstorm. Now the Wars of the Roses were really sparked off by the accession to the throne of Henry VI at the age of just 6 months. And he was thought of as being largely an ineffectual king. He suffered from bouts of mental illness throughout his reign. He was blamed by a lot of the barons, particularly up here in the north, for losing the 100 Years' War with France and making many disastrous decisions. And in fact, Richard the Duke of York actually ruled in his stead several times as a protectorate. Now, Richard the Duke of York actually had a claim to the English throne because he was a cousin of Henry VI. They were both descendants of the sons of Edward III. And during one of Henry VI's bouts of illness, Richard the Duke of York was proclaimed through an Act of Parliament to be Henry VI's successor, effectively ignoring Henry VI's own son. Now this all came to a head with the Battle of Wakefield, which was fought a few months before Towton, a bit further south, on the 30th of December. 1460, and we've covered that in another video. And in fact, it was at the battle where Richard the Duke of York was killed. His son Edmund was also killed on the bridge at Wakefield, and both the heads of Richard and his son were displayed on spikes on the gates of Micklegate Bar in York. One of the reasons that Richard the Duke of York came out of Sandal Castle to take on the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Wakefield is that he was waiting for reinforcements for his son Edward, who was in Wales at the time. And it's Edward, his son, who led the Yorkist forces here at Towton in retribution for the murder of his brother and his father. And before the battle even started here, the order was given for no quarter. That is, no prisoners were going to be taken. They were going to kill every Lancastrian they could find. Now, subsequent to the Battle of Wakefield, the Lancastrians and Margaret of Anjou, who was Henry VI's wife, took their son and they marched south. They had another victory at the Second Battle of St Albans, and then they marched towards London. At the same time, Richard the Duke of York's son Edward was making his way from Wales, and he had a big victory at the Battle of Hereford. He then himself started marching towards London. When news came of his approach, it said that the Lancastrians decided to retreat from London all the way back up to York, which was actually a Lancastrian stronghold at that point. So upon arriving in London, Edward, Richard the Duke of York's son, was crowned by the barons down there, and he was proclaimed King Edward IV. So by 1461 we were actually in a situation where we had two kings in England. We had the newly declared King Edward IV, and we still had the Lancastrian Henry VI. And it's at that point where Edward decided to march north to take on the Lancastrians and stamp his authority on the throne of England once and for all. So Edward marched north, sending Lord Falkenberg ahead with the vanguard, and it's on the 28th of March that they arrived in Ferrybridge, about 10 miles south of here, and they found the bridge was partly dismantled. And while repairing the bridge so they could cross it, they were attacked by a group of about 500 Yorkists led by Lord Clifford. So under pressure there, they were saved when King Edward IV arrived with the main body of the army, and they took on the Yorkists at that bottleneck on the river. And in fact they were in danger of being defeated until Lord Falkenberg outflanked the Lancastrians by crossing the river at Castleford and attacking them from the flank. And it's there that Lord Clifford was actually killed and the Lancastrians retreated. And were defeated at Dintingdale, not far from here, and the Yorkist armies advanced and camped overnight in Tadcaster, just across the way from here. This set the scene for the 29th of March, the Battle of Towton. Now this is Dacre's Cross behind me, and it's here where Lord Dacre, who was a Lancastrian commander, was shot by a Yorkist arrow and fell. So this is a memorial to him and all those who fell at the Battle of Towton. So it's here along this ridge where the Lancastrian forces formed up, and ahead of me to the south where the Yorkists were coming up the road here. So we'll go now and have a look at the Yorkist lines and see if we can follow the order of the battle. So it's around here where the Yorkists were arrayed in formation, the Lancastrians up ahead on that ridge ahead of us, and it's just over there where Lord Dacre's Cross is. Now this battle was very much dictated by both the weather and the landscape, and as mentioned, the 29th of March in 1461 there was a snowstorm with very high winds coming from the south. And as I said already up here, it's quite exposed. There's quite a few wind turbines all around the hills here. You obviously get quite a bit of wind around here still to this day. And this formed part of the Yorkist strategy here. So it was Lord Falkenberg who commanded the archers here on the Yorkist side, and he ordered them to march forward 40 paces, loose their arrows into the Lancastrians, and then fall back again. They then waited for the Lancastrian response. And of course, the Yorkist arrows all found their mark, assisted by the wind blowing from behind them, but the Lancastrians, attempting to return fire, found themselves firing into the wind. Not only that, but these winds from the south were also blowing the blizzard into the faces of the Lancastrian archers. So they couldn't actually see whether their arrows were making their mark or not. And in fact, all their arrows were falling far short of the Yorkist archers here. Now Lord Falkenberg gave the order for the Yorkist archers to hold fire and wait for the Lancastrians to completely deplete all of their arrows before again marching forward 40 paces, returning fire with their own arrows, and then, to add insult to injury, picking up the Lancastrian arrows that had fallen short and using them to return fire into the Lancastrians yet again. So it completely decimated much of the archers up on the ridge there. So realising that the game was up in terms of the archery contest, it's then that the Yorkist men-at-arms marched forward into this area, and a huge melee took place. Hand-to-hand combat, which is said to have lasted between 3 and 4 hours. And we know from the archaeology and the bone assemblages in the mass graves around here, there was a very bloody battle. And we'll be looking at some of the injuries that were involved along with the weapons a bit later. But effectively, this phase of the battle actually began to swing in favour of the Lancastrians. They were aided in fact by a cavalry or a horse charge from the west, which came into the left flank of the Yorkist army here. And it was actually Edward IV himself who rallied the troops on that flank to keep them fighting and keep them inspired long enough for reinforcements to arrive, as is always the case, just in a nick of time from Lord Norfolk, who had been sent while on the march north to gather reinforcements from the east, from Norfolk. So upon his arrival, that completely turned the tide of the battle, and they began to press home their advantage against the Lancastrians here. Now, according to records, a huge number of the peerage, the lords of the land, were killed in the Battle of Towton, in particular a lot of the Lancastrian lords. And it's up on the ridge there where Lord Dacre's cross is, where Lord Dacre was hit by a Yorkist arrow, and it's said that the archer who shot it was over by that tree over there in the distance. Now that's sort of a local anecdotal tale, and it's kind of been calculated that that's perhaps a little bit too far, but who knows, perhaps assisted with a particularly heavy gust of wind. The normal range of a longbow, which is around 250 metres, effectively the distance from here to the ridgeline up there, could have been extended with the gale force winds that were around during this battle. Now, with a lot of the peerage and lords being killed in this action here, the hand-to-hand fighting soon fell into disarray, and the Lancastrians ended up retreating with the arrival of Norfolk's troops. And they retreated back up to where Dacre's cross is, and they kept retreating northwest over the top of the plateau there. And we'll go up there to see what is known as Bloody Meadow. So around the periphery of Bloody Meadow there's actually this battlefield trail which has lots of information boards all the way around explaining various aspects of the battle. And this viewpoint here actually gives you quite a good view down over the topography surrounding Towton Moor here. There's quite steep-sided valleys on either side, so essentially where the plateau is, the retreating Lancastrian army were funneled northwest in this direction here. And down in the valley here you can see where a little stream known as Cockbeck runs, and on the day of the battle that was actually completely in flood because there had been several days of rain before the snow, so the whole of the valley bottom there was in flood, so it formed a bit of an impassable barrier for people in armour and with weapons coming down this steep, slippy, snowy slope behind me to try and escape. So they were kind of funneled down in this direction. Some of them were splintering off trying to escape, but all around Bloody Meadow here they've found caches of artefacts where it's been interpreted that there were several last stands of Lancastrians as they retreated piecemeal back across this land going in that direction, pursued by the Yorkists. So as the Lancastrians were forced into retreat along the plateau of Towton Moor, they found themselves again being faced with the steep slopes down into Cockbeck, which continues to meander around here, essentially cutting off their escape. But there was one bridge just down in the valley behind me here, Cockbridge, and that's where the old London road went between London and Tadcaster. So that was essentially the escape route. But you can see down in the valley behind me, it's still to this day, it's a very boggy, marshy area. So you can imagine what it must have been like when the river was in flood here, as it was at the time, and with all the snow on the slope here. So the knights in full armour would have been slipping and sliding down into the valley there, trying to cross the swollen river in flood, being pulled under the flood waters and drowning in this area down here. They actually formed what is known as the Bridge of Bodies, which effectively meant that more Lancastrians could escape across the river there using the bodies in the water as a bridge to get across. So quite horrific scenes. So with the rout and the defeat of the Lancastrians here at Towton, Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI and her son escaped over the border to Scotland, and Edward IV marched from Towton to York, where at Micklegate Bar he removed the heads of his father and his brother from the spikes on Micklegate Bar and replaced them with the severed heads of barons captured here from the Lancastrian army at Towton. So he went on to rule as King Edward IV until 1483, whereupon he was succeeded by his son Edward V, who, along with his brother Richard, became the princes in the Tower and mysteriously disappeared, only to be replaced by their protector, Richard of Gloucester, who became Richard III. Richard III ruled for a couple of years until 1485, until the infamous Battle of Bosworth, where he was defeated by Henry Tudor, later to be crowned Henry VII, finally bringing to the end the Wars of the Roses. So around the battlefield there's three villages: Towton itself, Saxton, and there's the old medieval village of Lead, which is now abandoned. It's here at the church in Saxton where Lord Dacre was buried, and this is his chamber tomb next to me here. And it's said that he was buried with his horse. We saw Dacre's cross on the battlefield where he was hit by the arrow in the Lancastrian Irons, and he was brought here after the battle and buried here in this tomb. It was actually later in the 19th century that they discovered a horse's vertebrae in the soil here. So it seemed that this particular local myth actually has some truth in it. But next to Lord Dacre's grave, there's this memorial behind me here as well, dedicated to all the fallen at the battle, but in particular it marks the spot where the bodies from a mass grave in Towton village were reinterred. They were discovered in the 1990s at Towton Hall, and archaeologists excavated those remains, and they became famous in the academic and archaeological world because the remains there showed an incredible variety of brutal traumas to the bone assemblage, giving us an idea of the nature of medieval warfare, and in particular in the Wars of the Roses, specifically at Towton, where famously there was this order of no quarter. Now, as part of my master's thesis project, I actually reconstructed some of those injuries using Photoshop, and I'll show you some of them now, but obviously they are quite brutal. Now, in terms of bladed weapons, there's skeleton 103, which shows a severed third and fourth metacarpal bones in the hand. So a bladed weapon obviously struck this person, probably incapacitating the use of their hand, making it difficult for them to fight. Even more famously, there's skeleton number 25, of a blade wound completely bisecting the face and even severing the nose. So quite a horrific injury, presumably against someone who didn't have a visored helmet, perhaps even a billman or an archer themselves. In terms of billmen, they fought with billhooks. These were essentially modified agricultural implements which had a long curved blade with spikes coming off it, which allowed it to be used in a variety of ways: to hook opponents' limbs, to stab, thrust, to block and parry. It had all sorts of uses. There is one particular skeleton known as skeleton 19, which has a blade wound across the left mastoid, which is sort of on the shoulder, so it's perhaps a billhook hooking that person and then lacerating their shoulder blade. Some of the most graphic wounds can be seen in skeletons number 9 and number 11. Number 9 has a hole in their cranium caused by a poleaxe, quite a clean square hole, so you can imagine the force of a poleaxe being brought down on someone's skull, possibly even through a helmet, and that would have caused catastrophic brain injuries, of course. Similarly, skeleton 9 has a wound to the head, but this is actually a blunt force trauma, perhaps caused by something like a mace to the head, again either coming through a helmet or onto the head itself. So inside the 11th century All Saints Church here in Saxton, it's very grand, very austere, and you get a real sense of the atmosphere, what it must have been like at Lord Dacre's funeral. and it's on the back wall over there just underneath the organ that the children from the local school just next door have created this banner depicting and memorialising the Battle of Towton. You can see they've got the red rose of Lancaster on one side and the white rose of the House of York on the other. And you can see all the combatants. You can see the arrow storm raining down, and then perhaps most tellingly of all, in the corner running red with blood, we've got Cockbeck. And it's to Cockbeck that we're going to go now. So if you cross over Cockbeck, right on the edge of the battlefield, you come to St Mary's Chapel here in Lead. Now Lead was a medieval village that was here on this site, no longer here, but the manor house, which once stood to the left of where the chapel now is, that's all now gone. There's just a few lumps and bumps left in the field, which show you where they were. We still have Manor House Farm here and the Crooked Billet pub across the way. Other than that, there's no traces for the village except for the chapel. So this was built as a chapel of ease for the village and for the manor house here. It was once twice the size of what it is now, but it was here at the Battle of Towton. And the battlefield is literally just on the edge, and Cockbeck runs right by the side of it. And it's this stream and river here which ran red for several days after the battle itself. But if you look in the Domesday Book, it lists Lead in there as belonging to Gunnar in the pre-Norman times. It then passed to the de Lacy family. Subsequent to the de Lacys, it passed on to the Tyas family. They were essentially vassals of the Norman de Lacy family. And as we go in, we'll see some fascinating tombstones of the Tyas family, including Baldwin Tyas, who fought on crusade with the de Lacys in the Holy Land. So one of the first things you notice as you come in and close the door behind you is the memento mori on the back of the door here. It says, "O mortal, whoever thou art, thou must surely die and stand before God in judgment. Art thou ready?" So that was written on the door in 1784 when there was a restoration of the chapel here. And a lot of the furnishings inside the chapel are from that period, including the three-tier pulpit at the far end there. The lower tier would have been for the clerk to sit. The middle tier would be where the Bible readings and the Gospel would have been read from. And the upper tier is from where the priest would perform their sermon to the congregation down below. Now the church here is also known as the Ramblers Church because it's a very popular footpath which runs down the side of the field by the farm there. And it was in the 1930s as a group of ramblers took it upon themselves to restore the heavily dilapidated church here. There was another restoration in the 1980s, again with the Ramblers Association, but also with the support of the Richard III Society because of their connection to the Wars of the Roses and the Battle of Towton. So you can see in the window at the far end the coloured panel of glass which has the white boar of Richard III in it. So originally the chapel here would have been twice the size. You can see the roofs being completely restored, but on the wall there are some bosses from the original ceiling, very decorative, and you can just make out on one of them there's some either gold leaf or gold paint flakes. So it's probably a very ornate, elaborate chapel at that time. It's at the far end, the altar. You can see there's a floriated cross on a small grave slab incorporated into the altar. The altar slab on top has 5 crosses incised into it, and they represent the 5 wounds of Christ. That's a motif you see a lot on medieval altars. We saw that, for example, at Jervaux Abbey. Now, it's thought there's been a church here for a very, very long time that predates this chapel, because a hogback tombstone was discovered in the grounds here while they were restoring it. But it's at the far end there, near the altar, where we have the tombs of the Tyas family. So these are the grave slabs of the Tyas family, who were lords of the manor here. You can see this one here, though, is clearly for a priest. There's a cross, and it has the chalice there, indicating that they were a priest. But these are the family crests of the Tyas family, with the 3 mullions, or mallets, or hammers. Now, that isn't really something you see in English heraldry too much. It's more of a continental European thing. And there's a bit of a clue in the family name, which we'll see engraved on the tombstones, which helps to perhaps identify their European background. So on this grave slab here, you can see inscribed Nobilius Miles Baldinius Teutonicus. So, Nobilius Miles means noble knight, and it comes before this person's name. So it's actually a title, Sir. Baldinius, Baldwin, Teutonicus. Now, Teutonicus is the Latin for the surname Tyas, and it's Germanic in origin. You might have heard of the Teutonic Knights. Now, interestingly, the Norman French for German person, was Tyas. So that might be how we get Tyas from Teutonicus. Now, beside him, we have his wife, Marjorie. It says, Domina Margo, Lady Marjorie, Biacius anime, propicietur Deus. Propicietur Deus. Here we have his son, Franco, whose inscription is actually in Norman French down the side there. And it says, you can just make it out, Priez pour l'Allemand François Tieski. So, priez pour, pray for, l'Allemand, the soul of François Tieski, Franco or Francis Tyas. And then here you can just make it out. It says, ici gist, here lies, chevalier, knight. So, pray for the soul of Franco Tyas, knight who lies here. So we have records of Baldwin Tyas throughout the decades around this time. He was involved in a contract, for example, with John de Lacy, his feudal overlord, with Kirklees Priory, a nunnery not far from here in Leeds. He also went to fight in the 5th Crusade with John de Lacy. They fought together at the Battle of Damietta in 1218. So not only do we have one of the bloodiest battles in English history, just on our doorstep here in the fields behind us, but we have a Crusader knight buried here in this little chapel in lead. Now, he married Marjorie Ellard, who's buried here next to him. Then over the subsequent decades, they essentially bought off parcels of land all around the north, and Baldwin Tyas is one of the northern branches of the Teutonicus Tyas family. Eventually all that land passed on to Franco, Francis, who lies here. Now, interestingly, the family coat of arms is described as having 3 mullets gules, or these 3 mallets, and it's a very similar shield to the de Lacy family's coat of arms, their feudal overlords, which is described as having 3 martlets. So it's interesting, we've clearly got 2 very closely linked Norman families here at the heart of Yorkshire, who also went off to fight in the Crusades. So that is the story of the Battle of Towton in 1461 and its connection to the churches at Saxton and here in Lead, where the streams are said to have ran red with blood. I do hope to see you in the next video, but until then, keep church searching.